So Chippewa canceled their heritage boot line about 2 years ago. We did a video on them and tried to go through like why we thought it might have failed, and eventually they completely sold out of everything that they were making in their heritage line, and it is no longer a thing until a few months ago when they re-released the very first heritage boot that I ever bought, which is this Chippewa Apache boot with the lug sole, and they re-released it. So we're gonna cut this thing in half, run it through the test to really see if this is the resurrection, the reviving of the Chippewa heritage line, or is this just a death rattle of a dying brand. So what is this boot? Well, the brand is Chippewa. The style is the classic 2.0 6-inch lace-up. They weigh 1 pound, 10.7 ounces. They retail for $209.95. The previous versions that we reviewed, to put that in perspective, were around $250 to $290 depending on which model you bought and which time and everything else. It's hard to find the exact price on them, but they're clearly more money than this version by anywhere between 40 and like 80 bucks. Another difference between them with the boot information is these are made in China, where these boots, they were handcrafted in the USA. And Chippewa got in a little bit of trouble by playing with the wording of that, and there's a lawsuit levied against them because they were importing parts and assembling them in the United States, so they got the verbiage wrong, but that's a pretty common thing to do that, especially in this price range. And so those are two very big differences, the price reduction and where they're manufactured. And then the way that they position this brand is from our archives and now better than ever with new built-in comfort technology and an ultra durable outsole. And even on their box they say the best by far. We'll see about that. And if you want a pair of these, be sure to check them out via the link in my description. So now start looking at the materials of this boot, starting with the leather first. And they say this is a premium full grain leather, but it's not full grain. You can tell it's a nubuck or a wax nubuck where they've taken a full grain leather that has all that cross section in it. They sand it down to remove any imperfections, throw a fat layer of wax over top, and make it look nice and smooth. But that's why you get this matte finish, and it has that weird effect of when you scratch it, it lightens up, but you can quickly hide those scratches by laying those fibers back down flat with a little bit of friction and heat. So even though they're wrong about it being a full grain, is it a bad leather? Well, we looked at the cross section to see how much grain was left. It seems like it's got plenty of the grain. It's a very saturated leather, as you can tell by the burning test that we did. It takes a long time to burn all those oils and conditioning they work into this leather. It's a very full leather. It's not really foamy and empty like you feel with a lot of boots in this $200 price range. It's 2.2-ish millimeters thick, so about the same thickness as the previous versions. It has a terrible puncture score at 32 pounds, but through and through, it's a pretty decent leather, especially for 200 bucks. It's a decent leather. So to me, the leather really hasn't changed in quality, and it's still up to the old Chippewa standard. Next, if we look at the inside and the lining of this boot, the vamp lining has changed from this canvas layer to what seems to be more of a sneaker layer or more affordable boot lining. I don't think there's gonna be a huge difference in durability. If anything, this new version might absorb your sweat a little bit more, but I lean towards more of the simpler canvas. I just don't want that much more material in my boot, and I don't like these synthetic style materials for linings. But performance-wise, I don't think there's gonna be a big difference between the two. So I would say, even though I don't like this lining as much, I would still say it's pretty close to the standard of the old Chippewas. But one thing on the inside I really don't like that they've changed is the way they do the counter. If you don't know what a counter is, it's that part of the boot at your heel that cups your heel, and a lot of times you get a little heel slip there, and it's one of the fastest wearing points on cheaper footwear. The old Chippewas, they had a dedicated internal leather counter cover, double stitched up the side. It is like 1.8 millimeters thick, so a nice thick counter cover. So what do they put in this one? Well, I've never seen anyone do it like this before. What they've done is they've taken a thin piece of Solastic toe stiffener essentially and didn't layer it over top of the quarter, but zigzag stitched it into the quarter so that there's no leather behind it, and they're using that as the counter cover. And the problem with that is you have that fail point where it's zigzag stitched, it's a lot thinner material, it's gonna wear a lot faster, and it's just not gonna be nearly as durable as a full leather counter cover. So to me, that does not live up to the previous version's standard. I think it's quite a bit cheaper and less durable enough that I would prefer the old version. Then if we look at the insole, just a typical insole, there's really nothing too crazy. It's an ortholite, so it's decent. But underneath is where we see some more of the really cheap stuff, because the previous version have a very typical fiberboard insole. You know, this is like a Texan style pink fiberboard. It's nice and thick. You got a lot of substance underneath your foot. It's dense. It's not really loose and fibery. Unlike this lasting material, it's still that pink fiberboard, but it's that really cheap Chinese junk that we see in these more affordable boots in like the sub $150 price range, like in these Rock Rooshes that we're gonna compare it to at the end of the video. The problem with that is they're not nearly as durable because it's a lot looser of a fiber structure. It's a lot thinner. It's a lot less durable. It might shape to your foot a lot faster, but it's that constant battle of like initial comfort versus longevity. There's always that balance. But to me, using this cheap and this thin of a insole material. There's really no excuse. There's no benefits that are worth it above what they used to use. So to me, pretty clearly, this old lasting board is significantly better. Then if we look at the midsole, it's fairly similar. The new version has a nice thick rubber midsole versus the previous versions either had leatherboard and rubber, or just rubber. And so to me, it's pretty close to the previous version. And not enough of a difference to point one way or the other if it's better or worse. Same story with the outsole. You still have this Vibram 132. It's a really popular outsole. It's the one I had on this hunting boot that I bought like 10 years ago for elk hunting. It's the most chosen outsole for all the heaviest duty work boots and logging boots and firefighting boots. It's a good solid outsole, and it's the exact same one as the previous version. So to me, that hasn't gotten better or worse than the previous versions. And another thing that's similar is the Goodyear welt. They're both the 360 Goodyear welt construction. It's a time-tested, durable way of making boots, but there is a difference between how these boots are constructed with that Goodyear welt, because the previous versions are very classic heritage boots. You know, the stitch density is a little bit tighter. It looks a little bit classier. The welt is a nice looking welt versus this new version. The stitching is a lot bigger. It's a lot looser. It's a little bit more sloppy. The welt doesn't look as nice as the previous ones. Is there a performance difference between the two? Probably not much really to be concerned about. I would still lean on the older version a little bit more than the new version, but aesthetically, that's to me where the big difference is. It just doesn't look as premium. It looks a little bit cheaper. It looks a lot more mass manufactured, that typical Chinese Goodyear welted style. So it's mostly aesthetic, but the aesthetics matter a lot with this because it is a heritage style boot, and it has a certain look, and it used to look very similar to the Wolverine 1000 Miles and the Red Wing Blacksmith that we just cut in half and reviewed. But the problem is now it looks like a completely different boot because they've changed up the paneling, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. They just added an external counter cover rather than just like the single backstay. But the biggest gripe I have is the different lasts they choose. It's a little bit wider, so you can have more wiggle room, but it's just not as nice of a looking last. It doesn't have that same Munson-ish look to it. It's a lot more bulbous, and it doesn't have that same look that everyone likes with these heritage boots. And once again, it's aesthetics, but to me, when you're buying a heritage boot, that's part of the deal. So technically, I don't think there's a big difference between the two. If anything, you could say this might be a little bit better because you have more wiggle room, but for my personal taste, I like the old versions a lot more. So there's some stuff that they've kept exactly the same. There's some things that have changed, some taste things have changed. So now let's cut this thing in half, really see what's on the inside, because a lot of times in this price range, the real difference in quality is on the inside because that's where you can hide all the flaws. So let's chop it in half and see how it compares. All right, we got it cut in half, and if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing because it takes a lot of money to buy 2 brand new pairs of boots and shoes every single week just to chop them in half. So any support you guys can give is hugely beneficial, especially when we're dealing with the YouTube algorithm and all that BS that we're constantly dealing with. So thank you guys for your support. So now let's see what's inside. Just like we expected, it is that really cheap, thin fiberboard. You know, you can see it's, I'll take a quick measurement. It's only 1.8, 1.9 millimeters thick versus the previous version is like 2.8 millimeters thick. And like I mentioned, it's a lot more substantial. You don't have nearly as loose of a fiber structure on the inside. It's a lot more firm. And then the other issue is you got a lot of loose layers. You know, this fiberglass shank, I like that it has a fiberglass shank, but it's just loose in there and I could easily dislodge and move around. It has foam underneath as the filling. It's just a really cheap foam that's not glued down to anything, which causes all those layers to slip independently and wear out prematurely, especially when you don't have a substantial fiberboard platform to stand on. And it looks a lot like the Rock Rooster we mentioned earlier in the video. It's basically the exact same style of construction, similar materials, but for $70 less. So if we compare it to a few boots in this price range, with the Rock Roosters at $130 with very similar components for $70 less. The Chippewa does have better leather though. Then if we look at the Carolinas at $180, which is $30 less, basically bettered every single way than the Rock Roosters. It's union made, it's assembled in the United States, and better components compared to the new Chippewa through and through. Except this doesn't have a leather welt. Then if you compare it to the Thursdays, which are the Value King, for $10 less, you get a leather heel stack, a leather midsole, better counter, better lining, better fiberboard, better foam, and you get a cork filling instead of foam for $10 less. And if you look at it compared to a more fashion style boot that's less about the components and materials and durability and more about style, for the $220 Solevaires that are $10 more, you get better fiberboard, better filling material, and then similar lining material, but surprisingly comparable. So looking at it compared to this spectrum of boots in a similar price range, I would say in order for it to be a good value, I would price it around 150 bucks. At $210, you're average to not great. I don't think it's a huge crime. If it was $250, it'd be severely overpriced. I still think it's overpriced, but it's not criminally overpriced. But it's clearly built to the same standard as the other Chinese boot in the Rock Rooster. So is this the return of the Chippewa heritage or just a ghost from the past? Well, it's definitely not better than the previous versions. It's definitely not as good looking as the previous versions. It's definitely not as good of a deal when it comes to value as the previous versions, but it's not completely atrocious. It's not like it's twice the price, but it is overpriced. But it's also a good amount cheaper than the previous version. So there's some play in here with the old version being more expensive, this new version being cheaper, but also made in China. It's not the worst option out there, but it's even further from the best option out there. So to me, I'm not willing to write off the Chippewa heritage all the way because I'm hoping this is just a stepping stone to the return of the better Chippewa heritage boots, because it's definitely not a full triumphant return of the Chippewa heritage. It's definitely not the best by far, and there's plenty of other boots for $200 that are significantly better. So let me know what you think of the value and the pricing, and what other boots at this $200 price range you think are better, which are worse, which other ones you'd like us to compare it to, because this $200 right on the nose price point is always really interesting to see what shell game they're playing to move certain components in higher quality, hide certain things, and it makes for a really interesting video, and that's why I find it interesting. So thank you guys for everything you do, and check these out. The link in the description if you want a pair, and I'll put the other videos to these other boots that we talked about and links to them as well. And thank you guys. See ya.